Hello, everybody. This is Phil Gorski, speaking to you live from Critical Realism headquarters in not so sunny New Haven, Connecticut. This week, we're delighted to have you here for a webinar on social science and realism after assemblage theory. A couple small innovations for those of you who've joined us in the past. We actually do have webcam feeds from both of our two speakers, and we do have two speakers this time around instead of one, whom I'd like to introduce now. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Tim Rutzou, who is a postdoc here with the Critical Realism Network, and our second speaker is Professor Dave Elder-Vass from Loughborough University in the UK, and they have been working together on an article on this topic, realism and assemblage theory, and are even thinking about writing a book on this topic. And so they're going to share some of their preliminary results and thinking from this joint project. And Tim Rutzou will actually lead us off today. And before we begin, I do just want to say a few quick notes for those of you who have not joined us in the past. The way that this works is that if you once the speakers are done, you'll have an opportunity to direct questions towards them, and the way that you're going to do that is not via the chat button, which you may already have noticed. You're certainly welcome to use that to chat amongst one another, but rather through the Ask a Question tab, which you will probably see in the upper left-hand side of your screen. So please, at any time, feel free to type in a question after or during the presentation, and then I'll do my best to pass on as many of those questions as possible to our two speakers afterwards. So without further ado, then I'll go ahead and turn it over to Tim Rutzou. Tim?
Thanks, Phil. So I'm quite happy to be able to talk about assemblage theory with Dave. We both think it's a very important development in terms of social theory and also the methodological implications it brings. So when we think about social theory, and particularly classical social theory, we're thinking about questions about reality, and particularly the nature of social structures, the nature of agency, and the methodological implications these theoretical questions have for social science. And these tend to be some of the more divisive issues and tend to divide not only social theory, but the various methodological approaches people take to explaining phenomena in the social world. They provoke the fierce debates about the appropriate conceptual toolkits for unpacking the various black boxes of the social world. But alongside the classic questions of structure and agency are associated questions about materiality, about practice, about relationality, about process, their various relationships, and their place within social scientific analysis. So the advocates of relations tend to claim a sort of long-standing social scientific dilemmas can be reformulated by casting the social and social relations, social primarily in terms of relations or structured relations. Meanwhile, there's an increasing chorus that has been arguing that for too long social science in general and sociological theory in particular has ignored the artifactual, the material, and the technological dimensions of the social world in favor of discourse and culture. Again, accounts which, then there are certainly more accounts which are emphasizing process or the processual nature of the social world and what some people have called process-oriented ontologies. And these tend to emphasize often the contingency, the fluidity, and the dynamism of the social world. And these are often juxtaposed with object-oriented ontologies, accounts which emphasize stability as the norm, something very akin to sort of autonomous essences and definite boundaries. And it's in the context of all of these different attempts to come to terms with the social that assemblage theory steps into the discussion. And one of the classic problems that assemblage theory is trying to come to terms with is the inherent and the irreducible heterogeneity of its objects, and what often becomes a perpetual oscillation between these different positions, collapsing heterogeneity in one way or another. So when we think about these various approaches, this is precisely what they tend to do. They tend to isolate one aspect of the social world and elevate it as, in many respects, the most important dimension, so that when we approach the social world, we want to approach it through one of these various positions, these visions, these lenses. The problem with this is that the social world consists of objects and relations and processes that are of very different sorts. So there are substantial and more object material aspects which encompass material features such as artifacts, such as technology, such as bodies, biological persons, and material structures. We might think of buildings, we might think of urban architecture, we might think of planning, ritual objects, tattoos, piercings, cultivated bodies. All of these emphasize a certain material nature to the social. And often these are, well, they are inherently social objects and social relations, but they're materially inscribed and exist in the form of sort of enduring material entities with certain social contexts. So if we think of tattoos, if we think of piercings, these are fundamentally social objects with social relations, but they are materially instantiated and persist at a material level. So we have this more substantial aspect of the social world, but then there are also social phenomena which are less material. They're more insubstantial. They're more rapidly they're rapidly changing. They're transient. They're short interactions, and so there's a juxtaposition between these two types of social entities. We're also dealing with phenomena that are sometimes centered and autonomous, as well as phenomena that are decentered and heteronomous, one being a sort of more associated with classical theory, the other with more post-structuralist approaches. So we have structures which are obdurate and recurrent, as well as structures which are dynamic, ephemeral, unstable, or what Sartre called metastable. And we need an account of social theory, and with social theory, a methodology that's able to deal with all of these different elements of the social world and these different types and kinds of things in the social world without collapsing it into one dimension. And this is where assemblage theory steps in and tries to resolve many of these tensions. Assemblage theory emerges from the work of Deleuze, Gilles Deleuze, sort of famous post-structuralist, and assemblage theory attempts in many respects to bring these elements together and particularly focuses on the way in which structures are decentered and heteronomous without then trying to lose the manner in which this crazy dynamic heterogeneous reality is made stable in particular ways. Now, just a sort of quick, the word assemblage is an attempt to translate the original French agencement, which refers to both the action of fitting together a set of components and the result of such an action. So the word assemblage encompasses aspects of both process and structure, with connotations that include arranging and arrangement, to dispose, disposition, combine, combination, construct, construction, ordering, order, arrange, arrangement. So it has this fundamental ambiguity which is played on, particularly in Deleuze. So what I want to do now, just for the next 5 or so minutes, is to give a very quick overview of the work of Gilles Deleuze and the manner in which that then informs the person we really want to get around to, which is Manuel DeLanda, who is one of the more interesting, in many respects, advocates of assemblage theory as it stands today. The other main advocate who's who's famous for also being involved in assemblage theory, and who we're not going to really address today, is Bruno Latour. So we're not going to address Latour. We're going to primarily address this strand of assemblage theory through the lineage, through a more direct lineage associated with Deleuze. So let's situate Deleuze, because he's an incredibly difficult thinker, and partly what makes him difficult is his tendency to try to rethink the fundamental language even that we use to understand the social world. It's a very deconstructive attempt, and it draws on a lot of literary references rather than social examples. And the classic work which really represents this is his book Anti-Oedipus, which is a long-form deconstruction of both psychoanalysis and Marxism, and the way in which Marxism has historically understood capitalism. So Anti-Oedipus is in many respects like the phrase on William Guthrie's banjo. It's a machine that fights fascism. It goes about and attempts to break up monolithic structures and show the manner in which these grand mechanisms, these grand structures, these grand systems, which have tended to be a focus of certain social theory, are far less stable than they appear. So for Deleuze and his longtime co-author Felix Guattari, as a structure, assemblages are something that's more akin to a living arrangement. They're unsettled and mobile, or they're nomadic, to use his metaphor, rather than fixed or hierarchical. And rather than the language of form or essences, assemblages are more characteristic of a conjunction between different elements and a series of interior and exterior relations between different entities in the social world that can't quite be separated. In many respects, it's drawing on the languages of wholes and parts to try to understand their relations. So an assemblage operates at this intersection and conjunction, the coalescence of these different components, and it becomes a sort of mobile army of multiplicities characterized by varied interactions and changing liaisons between heterogeneous and polymorphous parts, which are nevertheless formed into a sort of loose functioning machine. So as Deleuze suggests with his characteristic flair, the assemblage's only unity, and you can see this on the screen, the assemblage's only unity is that of a co-functioning. It is a symbiosis, a sympathy. It is never filiations, which are important, but alliances, alloys, and these are not simply successions or lines of descent. They're contagions, they're epidemics, they're the wind. And he draws on very metaphorical language to talk about the sort of nature of structures. So at the very least, it's a decentered structure. It's networks, it's a spider's web, it's an endless pattern, it's a decentered labyrinth, and one of the famous metaphors is a rhizome. And if we think about the metaphor and the work the metaphor is doing, a rhizome is it's a form of root system that's different from a tree root system. So if we think of a classic tree, we think of the roots sprawling down into the earth. They're deep roots, they're long, they're far-reaching. They create a stability of a tree. And in terms of the way in which social theory has often thought about this, we can think about it in terms of genealogies. We can think about it in terms of hierarchical relations, of foundations. Whereas a rhizome, which is well, from things like ginger, potatoes, or grass, they're more shallow, they're more shifting, they're more decentered. They spread out via something more akin to a sort of relationship of colonization, so that if you cut or remove one part, the structure still remains and can grow back. And so it's far more decentered, it's far more fluidic in that sense. It's far more changing, but in that change, there's also a stability, a persistence that remains. And so this is really what Deleuze and Guattari are interested in trying to think through as a neglected aspect of social theory. In many respects, we live amongst these partial objects, these decentered objects, bricks that have been shattered to pieces, various leftovers, wholes which need to be understood as fragmented or epiphenomenal. In many ways, they're illusory. Their centeredness is actually an attempt to coalesce what are essentially decentered wholes. So let me give 2 examples on how he addresses this or applies it within the social world, and then I'll move on to a couple of critical realist reflections. So the 2 big illustrations that he uses are of Freud and of Marx. So Freud, in terms of anti-Oedipus, if we think about the Oedipal complex as a mechanism, the Oedipal complex is universal, it's all-encompassing, it's something that sits over the social world and behind the social world and creates a degree of regularity. It's a mechanism through which all human beings must pass, and which understands and underscores a lot of social relations, according to Freud. So in deconstructing this, Deleuze and Guattari want to show that the Oedipal mechanism is neither universal nor necessary. It is at best what he calls a particular territorialization. And so if we think about psychoanalysis and the Freudian mechanism, you begin with a child whose entire body is an erogenous zone. Every aspect of their organism, of their being, is centered around a sort of very expressive form of desire, of touch, and what Freud wants to call a sort of form of sexuality. What happens through the Oedipal complex and the various stages of development is that this, what Freud calls polymorphous perversity, is territorialized into particular erogenous zones, generally centered around the genitals or the breasts, or all those sort of classic forms. And what Deleuze and Guattari show is that this is not only social, but it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of desire. Desire is far more perverse, it's far more diffuse, it's far more changing than the way in which they want to articulate it. We can also see when it comes to Marxism that as a lot of Marxists, particularly second generation Marxists, had a very, very strong conception of what structure looked like, what capitalism looked like, whereas Deleuze and Guattari want to in many ways resituate it in something more like almost like a post-colonial understanding, and rather than capitalism as this universal mechanism that's far more locally realized. In fact, they use the term schizophrenic. It's not something, it's not a single mechanism working behind to explain these various forms. It's actually a symbiosis between various mechanisms and machines and their local contexts. In some ways, we can think of this as a return to the manner in which Marx describes capitalism in the Communist Manifesto as a sort of process of uninterrupted disturbance. And so the famous phrase that when it comes to something like capitalism, all fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify, and all that is solid melts into air. And so we have an account of a mechanism and a process that's in perpetual change, transformation, that's transforming particular sites, but is actually responsive to those sites as well. And it's this perpetual process of sweeping away that characterizes something like capitalism, which gives it a schizophrenic quality as opposed to a sort of unified, centered whole. So So given that sort of expression of Deleuze and this radical decentered aspect, I mean, when critical realists have engaged with Deleuze, and this goes for post-structuralism in general. The excessive focus on relations, on change, on contingency, on difference, on the various heterogeneity of the objects, and some are listed on the screen in terms of the material forms and persons, bodies, and things, of actions, activities, agencies, episteme, scientific statements, concepts, discourse, capital, culture, politics, bureaucracies, institutions, and organizations, gestures, words, music, effect, desire. That this focus upon a sort of chaotic heterogeneity of elements that are situated within any situation that cannot be taken apart creates problems and seems to go too far. So that the radical project that Deleuze and Guattari seems to melt everything into air, into the wind, into this descended labyrinth where we can't find our way out, where there's no possibility of analysis, that we're left with this ineffable and diffuse ontology in which everything turns to smoke as soon as we try to grab a hold of it. And so we have this radical decentredness of structure that threatens to make ontology completely fuzzy, ill-defined, sort of witness in which everything and nothing is connected and boundaries perpetually bleed into one another. Now, it's not quite that as simple in Deleuze, but this is a sort of general characterization of the traits and his focus in trying to understand social structures. And this creates a number of problems of how critical realism would like to think through these. Namely, there are problems with how we understand causation, mechanisms, structures that are more hierarchical. But with that said, I'll hand over to Dave to sort of talk through some of these different elements.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Tim. As Tim said, I want to try to develop that this argument a little bit further by looking at some of the work of Manuel DeLanda. It'd be great if we could move on the slides to the DeLanda slide. So DeLanda is an assemblage theorist, very strongly influenced by Deleuze and Guattari. He's written a number of books where he has been offering his interpretation of Deleuze, which is a little different than some others in the tradition. He doesn't stress this, this quality of everything simply melting into air to the exclusion of stability, in quite the way that many Deleuzians do. He recognizes that this tradition is important because it gives us ways of thinking about, heterogeneity, the uniqueness of individuals, the contingency of events, the transience of many individuals. But at the same time, he recognizes the need, which many Deleuzians really don't, to have a place for making sense of things that are more stable, things that are similar to other things, things that we can think of as having somewhat consistent causal influences on the world, which is just the sort of thing that critical realists tend to think of when we think about objects in the world. So there's a sense in which he's trying to accommodate both the instability, transience, heterogeneity of the Deleuzian tradition with the more the analysis which is more focused on more stable things with consistent causal powers, which is probably the hallmark of the critical realist tradition. And this, we think, is it's the crucial move that's required really to make assemblage theory viable and useful. I mean, certainly there are things in the world which are unstable and transient. Certainly, critical realism already thinks of events as occurring in unique and transient situations. But there is also this need to make sense of things which are stable and exercise consistent causal powers. And DeLanda takes us in that direction. So let me give you some examples. Think about people. Okay, obviously every individual is unique. We're all constantly changing, but on the other hand, most of us persist, changing rather slowly over decades, sometimes many decades, and we tend to have many features in common with other people. It's what makes it possible for us to interact with each other socially, and sometimes we have more features in common with others of a particular type, if you like. So an ontology that doesn't really allow for stability, persistence, consistency, can't really cope terribly well with a lot of basic features of the social world. And this is not just true of individuals, it's also true of other kinds of social structure or object. Think about cues, for example. Maybe they're fairly transient, but they tend to be fairly similar to each other. Basketball teams, universities, not so transient. If we can't recognize that sort of social object, then we have difficulty in making sense of the social world. So in trying to bridge these two traditions, DeLanda is doing something enormously useful. Although I should say, by the way, that he, to an extent, he represents this as a reading of Deleuze, because he sees Deleuze talking about both of these sorts of features of the world. As he reads Deleuze, the concept of assemblage tends to be used to refer to these kind of heterogeneous, transient things that Tim was stressing earlier, and also he finds another concept in Deleuze which he calls strata, which is used to refer to more stable things with long-term causal influence. So he's conducting a kind of battle with the other Deleuzians for the spirit of Deleuze, as it were. But at the same time, he is reading beyond the Deleuzian tradition, and in particular, he explicitly acknowledges the work of Bhaskar, and we can see that in his treatment of the kind of more stable sorts of entity, he's drawing on some concepts which are familiar to critical realists. So certainly this kind of part-whole relation, that things are composed of parts. I mean, the way he puts it is that assemblages are composed of other assemblages. That fits clearly with our view of the world. He tends also to ignore something that we find in Deleuze and very much in Latour, which is the idea that things are composed not just of the routine material parts that we might associate with them, but also of kind of discursive material that relates to them. He tends to marginalize that, which again I think brings them into the same sort of space as critical realism. But perhaps the concept which differentiates them most from Deleuze and identifies them most with critical realism is the concept of emergence. Like critical realists, he argues that objects, including social objects, can have causal influence that is different from the causal influence of their parts, but arises from the way that their parts are organized in that particular kind of thing. Although he wouldn't use the phrase kind of thing, because the thing that he still resists from a realist perspective is the idea that things fall into types. He's very focused on the idea that things, including social objects, social structures, are all unique individuals, and he tends to, well, quite clearly positions this as being in conflict with the idea that things can fall into types. So I'll come back to this problem of types at least once again, but let me say a bit more first about how he reconciles stability and transience in his ontology. So if we could move on to the next slide. This is the key concept that we want to pick up here is the concept of parameters. This is an idea that Deleuze introduces in his 2016 book, Assemblage Theory, and he describes them as control knobs on the concept of an assemblage. What he's trying to get to here is that in talking about this issue so far, I've tended to talk, and in the Deleuzean distinction between assemblages and strata reflects this too. I tend to talk as if there's kind of one kind of things which are transient and unique and ephemeral, and another kind of things which are stable and persistent. But DeLanda's point here is that there aren't kind of two separate groups of things that we can label in this way, but rather that things, assemblages, fall across a continuum. Some things are remarkably transient, they exist a fraction of a second perhaps. At the other end of the continuum, some things are remarkably persistent. They might survive for millions of years. And then there's a range in between. Some things are really quite ephemeral, but last a bit longer than that, and they're a bit more stable than that. Some things are quite stable, but certainly go on for millions of years and can be disrupted more easily. So there's a kind of gradation, continuum of objects. Let's think of some examples. So clouds, for example, are pretty unstable, dynamic, transient. Birds don't live particularly long, but they're a lot more structured than clouds and a lot more stable in their structure during the time that they exist. Rivers, long-lasting hydrogen atoms, very, very stable, might survive for millions of years. And so we need to see things not as either unstable or stable, but as falling into a continuum. And the concept of a parameter helps us to make sense of that kind of continuum. The idea is that there are processes which, on the whole, we can think of as being internal to assemblages, which stabilize them. And different assemblages are stabilized to different extents by the particular processes that operate within them. So the parameter is a kind of specification of how far a certain process is able to stabilize or tends to stabilize a particular assemblage. And Deleuze in particular talks about two parameters. First of all, what he calls territorialization. So territorialization is a generic term for processes which stabilize assemblages by producing internal homogeneity and or sharp borders. And so it's not immediately apparent why those things should go together, but it becomes clearer if you look at an example. So DeLanda talks about human social communities. And he says, well, a social community may become more territorialized if, for example, it introduces certain expectations of cultural conformity. If everyone in the community is expected to adhere to certain practices, then what's happened is that the parts have been homogenized, and the implication is that they are now more clearly differentiated from people outside the community who don't share those practices. So we have a kind of process of territorialization. And so the territorialization parameter expresses the extent to which a particular assemblage is stabilized in that sort of way. And the kind of community we just talked about would probably have quite a high territorialization parameter, whereas certain other kinds of human structures, a crowd maybe, might not have the same degree of territorialization. So there's one example of a parameter. The second one that he focuses on a lot is the idea of coding. So coding processes are processes which stabilize assemblages through expressive components such as language or chromosomes, because as a second example of that, I'm not really convinced that chromosomes are expressive components, but you can see there's a kind of parallel. They do both involve a kind of coding of structure. And here again, an example might help. So an organization may have a constitution or a set of linguistically coded rules, which helps to stabilize how it operates and maintain a kind of persistence over changes in personnel, for example. So some organizations are more stabilized than others. So through this kind of process, they would have a higher level of the coding parameter. Some kinds of assemblages aren't really stabilized in this way at all, so they would have a very low coding parameter. So that's roughly how he uses this concept of parameters to try and make sense of both highly unstable transient assemblages and more stable persistent assemblages within one and the same ontology. Now, so if you could move to the next slide again. It should be clear that there's quite a lot we like about this. He's quite clearly realist about both the kind of more ephemeral assemblages and the more stable entities, the ephemeral things which are relatively neglected in critical realism. So to have someone who shows us a way of being realist about those is a useful addition to the realist tradition. And at the same time, he's a realist about more stable, persistent entities, structures, if you like, which are relatively neglected in many versions of the Deleuzean tradition. And it's very valuable to see the relation between the two as a kind of graduated one rather than a binary separation. And his parameters concept makes that quite clear and sensible. Having said that, though, we think there are still some important gaps in DeLanda's ontology. Most importantly, his rejection of causal types. It does take us some way, I think, towards the idea of causal types, in particular with the concept of attractors, which he draws from Deleuze, which we also find in the complexity theory tradition. And the idea of an attractor is that there are sometimes stabilizing forces that tend to pull some assemblages towards particular stable configurations. And of course, that's quite similar to the sort of thing we've been talking about already. But he resists the obvious conclusion that you would expect that to lead multiple assemblages to converge in similar configurations. Once we've got attractors and we think there's such a process which arises from a certain kind of structure, a certain kind of parts, then for a realist or critical realist, then the natural expectation is that that process will be replicated in other structures with similar parts and similar configurations, and will tend to produce multiple assemblages, multiple objects or entities which have a similar form. And once we've got that, we're getting pretty close to the concept of a type and things falling in type. But despite the argument having that kind of potential, DeLanda resists that rather strongly. We're also a little unconvinced by the particular parameters he focuses on, coding and territorialization, He presents them as being rather general, but I'm not really persuaded that that's the case. Just to make one small point on that, this idea of territorialization rests on the idea that objects are stabilized by making their parts homogeneous. Well, actually, many objects are stabilized by making their parts heterogeneous. Organizations, for example, a business corporation in which every employee was the chief financial officer wouldn't really be terribly effective. Organizations work because roles are differentiated. There's a division of labor between different roles. So in that sort of case, structure, an assemblage is stabilized by making the parts heterogeneous, not by making them homogeneous. So it doesn't seem like these processes are particularly general. So if we could have the next slide. What I think we'd like to do is to take DeLanda's idea, certainly take this perspective that tries to unify more and less stable things into one coherent ontology, and to take a version of the concept of parameters to help us to do that. But we think that we can use the parameter concept a little bit differently. There are lots and lots of specific mechanisms that stabilize different kinds of assemblages. In addition to territorial encoding, a huge number of others. Just to give a trivial example, some assemblages are stabilized by using nuts and bolts. Bicycles are assemblages that are stabilized using nuts and bolts to keep them together. Now, it seems odd. It seems odd because this is a kind of, I think it's a methodological decision that we have to make here. Is there any point in saying, well, every assemblage in the world has a parameter which specifies the extent to which it is held together by nuts and bolts? Is there any point in having a vast range of parameters, most of which are zero for most entities? Or just to say, well, different things are stabilized by different mechanisms, and for this particular thing, well, these are the mechanisms that are in operation. So, not really convinced by the way that DeLanda uses the parameter concept there. However, we think that the thing that it does capture, which is extraordinarily important, is a kind of more general thing, and he's heading towards this generality with his concepts of territorialization and encoding, but I don't think he quite gets there. And the general feature which is of interest is, to what extent does a particular assemblage or a particular kind of assemblage have a tendency to persist and recur? As I've said, if the parts of a thing have a tendency to fall into a certain configuration, if there are mechanisms of all the kinds, any of the kinds that we've talked about that tend to do that, then that increases the tendency of an object or an assemblage of that kind to persist, to survive, to stabilize. And equally, if there is a tendency of that sort, a set of mechanisms that tend to bring about that sort of persistence, then we can reasonably expect that that tendency will be exercised in many cases where that sort of part comes together in something like that sort of configuration. And so a high tendency to persist is generally likely to also produce a high tendency for structures of that kind to recur. Now, it's worth saying that the strength of that parameter depends on the parts and the sorts of processes that occur between them, but whether it's realized or not, and this is very much in the spirit of critical realist concepts of tendency, whether it's realized or not in a particular case does depend on the context. nuts and bolts tend to keep a bicycle together, but if you throw the whole thing into a blast furnace, then they'll melt along with the rest of the bicycle. It won't do that job anymore. And we could multiply examples of that endlessly. So tendencies aren't exceptionless in their implementation, but their realization depends on the context. Okay, so that's useful, I think, because it gives us not only a way to make sense of the relationship between transience and stability amongst different kinds of objects, because it also gives us a way to make sense of the recurrence of similar objects, objects in what we might call loose types. So, people, if you like, is a loose type. There are lots of people who are very similar in many respects, but there's some vagueness about that. There's some variation between individuals. We can also have nested types. So you might think of men, for example, as being a type that is nested within people. We can have cross-cutting types. All that is perfectly viable within this concept of types. Types don't tie us down to kind of rigid belief that individuals of the same type must be identical with each other. So that's the sort of concept of type that I think we can productively combine with the approach that DeLanda has taken here. So to conclude, if I can have the next slide. What are the implications then of taking account of assemblage theory for critical realism and for social science? This is the original brief for this presentation. Well, first of all, I think we can say that synthesizing the idea of causal types that comes from critical realism with assemblage theory's focus on the kind of uniqueness and fluidity of individuals is something which is highly productive. It gives us a way of making sense of the world in general and the social world in particular that allows for different kinds of objectives. It's a way of avoiding a kind of dogmatism about the form of the form that objects take. It's worth saying that critical realism has already got a place for uniqueness and fluidity in its talk of actual causation. Realism's account of cause is that things of a certain type have a certain kind of causal power, but what happens in an actual situation depends on a contingent set of those things coming together, and each of those situations is unique, and we can't necessarily predict how that's going to turn out. So there's a space for contingency in critical realism already, but it's quite closely tied to the idea that objects in themselves tend to fall into reasonably well-defined types with a certain kind of stability and influence on the world. And by bringing in assemblage theory, we can open up the possibility that there are objects in the world with causal influence, which is unique to the particular configuration that occurs for a very short period of time. So we're allowing for different kinds of things to be parts of the ontology, which weren't really accommodated in critical realism before. In a way, that's the implication for critical realism. I think that arguably there's an implication for assemblage theory too, and that DeLanda's work helps to show us how we can bring the more critical realist sort of perspective on objects and their causal influence into assemblage theory too. So heading towards some sort of possibility of synthesis between those traditions, but not necessarily on terms that either tradition might be happy with as it stands at the moment. And And then that, I think, is useful for thinking about the social world, because realistically, if we're going to think about the social world productively, we need ways of doing that that recognize, on the one hand, that there are stable social forces that fall into regular types with consistent sorts of social influence, and on the other hand, that there are unique configurations turning up for brief periods of time, which can also change things radically. We need a view of the social world that allows us to accommodate both kinds of causal forces in the way that we make sense of what is going on in our world today. So I'll stop there, and I think at this point we probably are going to move on to questions. Unless, Tim, you want to add anything else?
And thank you, Dave and Tim, for that really excellent summary of Deleuze and DeLanda's work. Great, and its possible implications for critical realism, ways in which it might enrich critical realism and vice versa. I would definitely encourage folks, if you have any questions, to sort of jump in, and please do type those in via the Ask a Question tab that you should see on your screen. I do have a couple questions of my own, though, which I'd like to throw out there to both of you to kind of kick things off. And the first question concerns language about types, kinds, resemblances. So, the language of types, as I'm sure you guys both know, typically comes out of a kind of neo-Kantian perspective, enters into social science via Weber, right? So, here we think about types as being things that appear to us, but not necessarily things that exist in the world. And then there's a language of kinds, an older language of kinds, as being things that actually exist, as it were, in nature, out in the world, that we can discover and have knowledge of it, but exist as kinds, whether we perceive them as such or not. And then, a kind of common way of trying to reconcile those two is to invoke Wittgenstein's famous idea of family resemblances. And I'm just curious to hear whether you guys have any further thoughts about what the right direction is for critical realists to go. I mean, some people have said, well, maybe there are social kinds that are actually akin to natural kinds. And I don't know that view has a lot of fans, but it's one that some people have expressed. Other people, including George Steinmetz and myself, have mused from time to time about whether, instead of talking about ideal types, we should talk about real types. And at some point, I hope in the fall, he and I will have a conversation about what that might mean and how real types might be different from ideal types. And you guys introduced another formulation, which was this one about loose types, right? Where you, I guess, acknowledge a variety within some kind of unity, and you understand that unity to be something that is real in some sense. And you use the example of persons, Dave, but what are there then loose types when we're talking about different kinds of social structures? Anyway, that's a whole host of different questions, but thought I would throw that out there for your consideration.
Well, I'd be happy to answer some of those, and then Tim can come in and probably disagree with me.
Maybe.
Yes, so types, kinds, and resemblances. Yeah, an excellent question. I was talking in types mostly to avoid antagonizing people who don't like the concept of kinds, but I like the concept of kinds. I think that kinds exist in the world independently of what we think about them. Not in the sense that there's an object called a kind, but in the sense that there are things out there that have similar structures and as a consequence behave in similar ways, or at least have similar kinds of causal properties, and are the types that we, the categories, if you like, that we develop in thinking about the world can reflect those kinds well or badly. For example, the idea of persons. I think that we have a category that we call persons, and in it we include human beings in general. And I think that's pretty well mapped on to a natural kind. Human beings have a lot in common, and they have fairly common, or a range of fairly common causal properties as a result. They also differ in lots of ways, but that's entirely consistent with them being members of a natural kind. So I'm happy with the natural kind concept. I think that it's often misinterpreted by its critics. I think often people criticize the idea as if it entails that every member of a certain kind is identical to every other. It doesn't entail that. And that was also the reason that I called them loose types, so as to try and make clear that it doesn't entail that. But the loose is just a sort of rhetorical addition, and I'm still talking about kinds in just the same way. And are there social structures, or social kinds, natural kinds? I think social kinds are natural kinds. And that, of course, illuminates the sense in which the word natural is being used there. It's a kind of conventional sense. It doesn't mean that these kinds are somehow part of a dualistically divided world in which they are natural kinds are distinct from the social. It simply means that they exist separately from what we think about them, and there are kinds of social objects of which that is equally true. So I mentioned cues earlier. Cues, I think, are a nice example of that. So you get cues in many, many different situations. They're stabilized as a type primarily by a set of norms about queuing, and they kind of a set of groups of people who endorse those norms, what I call norm circles. And the consequence of those people having, those beliefs in those commitments to queuing norms is that in many situations of a certain type, they form queues. And queues have characteristic causal effects. They enable people to, serialize access to a resource without coming to blows or other kinds of conflict, for example. So queues are an example of a social structure that is a social kind and a natural kind in the sense that I use the word. I'm conscious that that's a slightly controversial answer to your question, and Tim might want to disagree.
Yeah, I would tend to disagree with the language of kinds and types, and to sort of bring it back to the way in which Deleuze addresses this problem. I mean, one way of thinking through the way in which Deleuze approaches things is that he begins with the world being open, and he wants to end with the world being open. And so there is this constant, well, not constant, it's a bit more complicated than that. I gave a very characteristic account of Deleuze, but there is a very real sense in which he sees the world as fundamentally open at its sort of basic level, wants to end or return to that sort of state in creative ways. So one of the categories that that sort of connected with all of this is Deleuze's distinction between the actual and the virtual as being an important point for mediating this question. So the virtual is, in many respects, it's very similar to what Bhaskar calls the domain of the real, and it constitutes the what Deleuze and what Foucault, who draws on a similar notion, calls the field of possibilities, or the space of possibilities. So in this sense, it's what exists but isn't actualized, and it exists in the form of mechanisms that are dormant, that aren't realized, that are operating in conjunction, and potentialities, tendencies which aren't realized. And this exists as a sort of virtual space, a virtual field of possibilities, in which processes of individuation take place. So from within that space of possibilities, this open field, you have particular realizations, particular individuations in different ways from within that space. This is tied up with Deleuze's notion of territorialization and deterritorialization, which you could also use the language of individuation, which is looking at the whichness of particular situations, how particular, unique, isolated or local things occur. And through processes of territorialization, things are made consistent, they're made homogeneous, various limits are drawn, and that's a sort of process of individuation. And deterritorialization is the opposite movement, from the individual back to a sort of more opening of the space of possibilities in that sense. So where does this leave kinds? I think Deleuze, and I think I probably agree with Deleuze on this, the language of kinds and types can be, it depends where we want our focus to be. So Deleuze is far more interested in trying to articulate the various mechanisms, machines, or processes of individuation than he is in trying to come to language of types. In fact, one of his characteristic book, Difference and Repetition, is very much about this problem and rejecting or trying to find a way around the sort of language of repetition, in which repetition is understood as a continual repetition or creation of the same sort of thing of a typology, whereas he wants to focus on the sort of difference that's even embodied in that. So even when there's a high degree of homogeneity or similarity between different events, there's still a fundamental difference that's really important to hold on to, so that the field of possibilities, that sort of space, is there, it's present even within these particular individuations, which gives everything a sort of unique quality, but a unique quality in not necessarily overly interesting ways at times. So I mean, the example would be the sort of factory production line. Each thing is unique, but it's got such a high degree of homogeneity because of these sort of mechanisms of individuation, that there's a huge that the individuations, the various individuations, the sort of repetition associated with that, are just so fundamentally similar that that we can talk about it in a way. So I mean, this sort of comes back to this language of loose types, and this is a sort of tricky aspect. So Deleuze, and I would want to focus on the processes of individuation and that relationship between the field of possibilities. It then raises the question, just how open is that field of possibilities? And I mean myself and I would say Deleuze doesn't want to define that. And part of this is a reaction against particular forms of thought and ways in which things will have been articulated in terms of kinds and types. But I think that aside, it's not just a reaction.
Perhaps not. Okay, let me carry on then. Yes, I mean, one of the things that we say in the paper, on the paper is still in a sort of state of transience at the moment. It's it's definitely not been stabilized, but one of the things that we say is that it's almost as if Deleuze's ontology and Bhaskara's ontology have been developed as responses to different problematics. That, you know, Deleuze, I mean, Tim put it nicely when he talked about Deleuze being focused on mechanisms of individuation. And I think that's, and Tim knows Deleuze much better than I do, but that seems to reflect what we might call a problematic of origins. You know, what Deleuze is interested in is how do things come to be the way that they are? How does the world come to be populated with the things that it's populated with? And in that kind of problematic, perhaps you don't need causal types. And certainly reading DeLanda, he kind of reacts against the language of causal types as relating to a conflicting theory of how things come to be the way they are. I mean, I don't know if anyone ever actually has this theory, but he describes essentialism as a kind of theory in which, and this is a kind of Platonic thing, isn't it? The idea that things come to be the way they are because there are types already, and then types somehow get to be. Now that has some kind of causal influence or processual influence on instances of the type coming about. Now, clearly, you know, that would be a nonsensical view to have, and I, you know, absolutely with DeLanda and Deleuze and rejecting that kind of account of how things come to be. I don't think types bring instances of the type into existence at all. So in that sense, you know, I accept their criticism. But I think Bhaskara's concerned with a different kind of problematic. He's concerned with what we could call a problematic of causal power. You know, how can things have causal influences? How can things have causal influences that we can recognize and apply in science and technology? And in that kind of problematic, the fact that different things which share the same structure have similar influences becomes very, very important. And so causal types become something that is an important part of an ontology of causal power. Now, you can argue about exactly how to conceptualize them, but if we're going to have an ontology that addresses both the question of origins and the question of causal power, then I think we need to bring kinds back in, but make sure the way that we're thinking of kinds is absolutely not the form of thinking about kinds that Deleuze and DeLanda reject, not this idea that kinds somehow bring about instances of the kind. Kindness, if I can use that phrase in this context, that's a word in this context, is kind of derivative of the nature of actual things. You know, things come about because of, you know, Deleuze and DeLanda's attractors. They have a tendency to come about in similar form to each other, and when we get things that have a similar form, they have a tendency to have similar impacts on the world. So for me, that's what it means to say that things fall into kinds, and that's important for the causal account of the world. And I think that could be reconciled with the resistance of Deleuze and DeLanda to a different way of using the concept of kinds. Phil, do you have any more questions?
I do, yes. So there are a couple of questions that have come in, and one I think follows very nicely on from the conversation we've been having. Here's the question. Could you elaborate a little bit on the nature of context? Are assemblages here providing the context for other assemblages? I'm a little confused about how the relationality between assemblages might be envisaged. If you yourselves or DeLanda have any guidance, that would be great.
So context, the question of context is actually a really sort of pertinent and really interesting one in this sense. It comes down to, again, how we understand this relationship between heterogeneity and homogeneity and where we place the emphasis. So partly in response to bridge what Dave was saying with this question, for Deleuze and I think DeLanda as well, the question is where stability is located and where homogeneity is located. And so, I mean, Deleuze explicitly, there's three people he really sets up. Well, there's a whole series of people he sets himself up against. One is Kant, one is Hegel, one is Plato. And this sort of Platonic relationship that he sees as in some respects problematic is that the forms or the types are homogeneous. They exist up here, and then difference is sort of existing down here in the material world. And Bhaskar sort of goes this way as well, that our knowledge of the world is changing knowledge of unchanging things, which is a really unfortunate phrase that he uses. But it sort of captures that sort of aspect to it, whereas if we were going to use a sort of Deleuzean phrase in response to that, it would be our knowledge is changing knowledge of changing and heterogeneous things. So heterogeneity is inherently up here rather than down here, and that's his anti-Platonic stance. Because, you know, Plato, you have order, then you have chaos. For Deleuze, he wants to say we have chaos, and then we have order. So the problem isn't how do we account for heterogeneity and chaos, it's how do we actually account for order. And this is where, in many respects, this relationship between different assemblages fits in, because we have these diverse things that are embedded within other diverse things and their relations, their contexts. So again, if we position this against Bhaskar often talks in terms of internal relations. So internal relations and then external contingency. Effectively, one is a sort of necessary, internal necessary, external contingency. What assemblages do in terms of this relationship between assemblages within assemblages is tries to not blur, but to pull apart this distinction. So assemblages are always constituted not only by internal relations in the way things are held together with a degree of homogeneity, but then the way in which it's situated within other assemblages which have this relation. They have their own sort of interior homogeneity that's created, but then they're operating in relationship and conjunction with one another in context, in situ, to create these different forms. So, I mean, we haven't spoken so much about this, but one of the characteristic metaphors Deleuze uses is of machines, and he uses this in context with assemblages. So, the characteristic aspect of a machine is not only a certain degree of coherence between the parts which are aimed to produce a particular affect, so you have heterogeneity, you have homogeneity, and then you have sort of process of that emerges from that. But the manner in which he talks about it in terms of machines plugged within machines. So we're looking at these sort of relations, the way in which different assemblages of different machines are situated and relate to one another. And there's a sense in which, and this is sort of a Latourian moment as well, there's a sense in which at a methodological level, what Deleuze wants us to do is to follow the paths between different machines. Now, those paths are always more chaotic, and they go off in different directions. But there's also a sort of orderliness to them, because these are sort of territorialized, because they're made into a homogeneous, well-functioning, well, not well-functioning always, because machines do break down. They spit and spurt and run into all sorts of problems. But effectively, you're tracing the flow of affect, the way in which one machine affects another machine affects another, and the way these sorts of things come together as a machine to follow the various processes that are taking place in the social world. And at a very crude level, we can call this, when it comes to human beings, we can call this the process of socialization, and the way in which people, as they go through life, this is very, very crude, but the way in which they interact with different machines, and those machines create particular affects, which then, you know, starts to individuate that person in particular ways. And so, you know, we wind up with individuals rather than automatons or machines, like robots or whatever you want to call them.
Indeed. Maybe I could add to that. And this question about assemblages and context, I think perhaps points to a difference between different usages of this concept of assemblage. And the way that DeLanda uses it, it fits fairly closely with the way that a critical realist might talk about entities or objects, or that sort of thing. And if you think of assemblages in that sense, then to say, well, some event has occurred in a particular context means that, you know, there were a certain bunch of other assemblages out there influencing the event as well as the one that we're focused on. And so DeLanda and realism, I think, kind of converge on that way of thinking about cause. But perhaps the question is prompted by the fact that Latour thinks about assemblages rather differently. For Latour, an assemblage is like everything that influences a particular situation. So it's not as if we could say, for example, that you know, a train was an assemblage and an engineer was an assemblage, and you know, a computer software program was an assemblage, and you know, what happened when someone presses the engineer presses the button to open the train door is a consequence of these assemblages interacting. For Latour, you know, when somebody presses the button that's supposed to open the train door, all of those things are part of the assemblage. You know, the engineer, the train, the person that pushed the button, the computer program, the way that all those people have talked about those things, they're all part of the assemblage. So for Latour, I think the context is the assemblage, and so he's got a different concept of assemblage, which leads to a different way of thinking about context. So I think that probably may help to elucidate the thought that lay behind that question.
Okay, so we're coming towards the end of our webinar here, but I do have a question that I think will be a nice way to close things out, and this is asking both of you to think about the political context and normative implications of Deleuzian assemblage theory. And the question is, if only in part from a metaphilosophical stance, that is anti-Oedipus emerging out of post-1968 France, what might be the implicit and tacit normative commitments of these assemblage social theories? Is the position and specific activity of the theorist accounted for in a way by assemblage theory? And how does theorizing about assemblages come to affect agency or actions in comparison to agency or actions without such theorizing?
So, if it's okay, I'll start, because one of the sort of characteristic ways that post-structuralism has been disregarded, and this was fairly early on in the piece, and so, for example, Luc Ferry in France made this sort of point that when it comes to people like Deleuze and the post-structuralists and the postmoderns, what they're really doing is that they're really reflecting on the failures of '68, and they're embodying that in theory. Sorry, this is a pet peeve of mine. So firstly, there were plenty of post-structuralist things that were before '68 and were sort of building up to this sort of process. In terms of the contextual relations and the political relationships and the possible normative aspects, I mean, this comes through. there is, I mean, there's a very real sense in which Deleuze and Foucault and others of that era are anarchists and are reacting against particularly the French education system. I mean, Deleuze explicitly, I mean, he thought a lot of his colleagues were clowns, and so he took it upon himself to actually to embody that and play the clown. And in fact, just as a fun story, I wrote it, when he was tired in class, he would actually entertain his students by playing the musical saw. So there's a very playful aspect to a lot of these authors. They're reacting against a very rigid social context. Now let's contrast this to Bourdieu, because Bourdieu is part of this group as well. When we think about something like field theory, it tends to be uncritically applied, and it tends to be decontextualized and dehistoricized as a result. But Bourdieu is also reacting to this context and the sort of rigidity of field theory when we think about, I mean, the Homo academicus, when we think about the tight distinction between doxa, habitus, capital. This is very much as well a sort of an expression of his historical and political context and the rigidity of the French intellectual system, the school system. And because a lot of these people were influenced by Marxists, I mean, the Parti Communiste Français were the most Stalinist Marxist organization around at the time. So there's very much a sort of anarchic impulse in all of them. One of the other interesting aspects of it, I mean, and again, this is where it's interesting in terms of the developments that take place within capitalism. And you know, Foucault, for example, has been, some people have talked about him as being sort of complicit with neoliberalism, and he did sort of explore certain aspects of that. That sort of radical withering away of the state and the desolidifying anarchic aspects of their politics is certainly there. For Deleuze, in terms of politics and the normative aspects of assemblages and these social theories, he is very much trying to disrupt. I mean, it's a disruptive exercise. It's a disruption of capitalism. It's a disruption of various political forms which have ossified and need to be made to melt into air. And in particular, he does this through desire and the sort of polymorphous aspects of desire, which sort of brings out a radical anarchism. So again, we find this, to use that sort of that language I drew on before, you begin with an open world. The goal is to end in an open world, rather than and the closure takes place in between those moments. And so the closure is artificial rather than natural. And there's a need to disrupt that in the name of diversity, sort of different type of diversity, to return to, in some respects, the sort of fundamental ontology of the world. I'll just say one quick thing as well, just on this. So as an anarchist, he actually makes an explicit point in an interview, called Politics, where he says that the problem that we face is that we can't, if we think in terms of territorialization and deterritorialization, there's a balance here that's very, very tricky, because you can't just deterritorialize everything immediately. This is a process, and that sort of, I mean, there's almost a sort of recognition of anomie here, that the dissolution of all norms in a sort of rapid pace is actually not necessarily a good thing, but there needs to be a recognition of this fundamental sort of relationship that needs to be worked out. So that sort of process of closure and opening needs to be very, there needs to be reflection on how that sort of is done to actually prevent more damage from happening.
Okay, I don't think I have as much to say about that as Tim did, but I thought that was a fascinating reply. One of the things that particularly intrigued me was this idea of Deleuze and Foucault as anarchists. There's a sense in which, you know, Deleuze is a kind of trying to represent the world anarchistically, isn't there? his politics may be anarchist, but he's also his description of the world as transient, unstable, lacking structure. It's almost like portraying the world as if the world was naturally anarchistic.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, at points, Guattari and they talk in terms of chaosophy. They talk in terms of chaosmos, taken from one of the, rather than cosmos, you have chaosmos, and they also use the language of a crowned anarchy.
Which is interesting, because perhaps there's a sense in which that's kind of wishful thinking about ontology. I mean, it's like let the world be anarchistic and almost refuse the fact that in some senses, in some respects, the world isn't quite that anarchistic. There's chaos, but there's also order, as you said earlier. And so we need some sense of both in our ontology. But the other thing about anarchism, of course, is that it's also quite close to kind of right libertarianism, and there's a sense in which Latour seems a bit like he's taken it in that direction. That Latour seems to be radically opposed to any kind of political critique, and to see his version of Deleuzianism as a way of kind of undermining structural sociology, not just because he doesn't like the ontology of structures, but also because it's traditionally been associated with a kind of critical position. I don't want to put too much store on the political aspects of that, because I'm being a bit speculative here, but it does seem that if we want to make a political critique, then we're going to have to think of there being some stabilities in the world that we're going to be critical of, and some stabilities in what a more desirable kind of world might look like. So I'd like to think that some kind of introduction of a greater degree of realist thinking might help us to do that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dave, and also Tim, for this really stimulating conversation. And those of you who are still with us, I just do want to draw your attention to some of our upcoming webinars. Please stay tuned for a couple of webinars this summer that will focus on how critical realism helps us to do better empirical work. And the next one will be with Claire Decoteau from the University of Illinois Chicago, and Doug Porpra from Drexel University, who will be talking about that in July. We're still working on the schedule. September, we will likely be doing a webinar with Christian Smith from Notre Dame on his new book, which is a critical realist theory of religion. And then finally in October, there will be the webinar that I already alluded to on real types versus ideal types, and that will be a conversation between myself and George Steinmetz. So thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your summer.